Hello, my name is Reva Goujon, and today I'm joined by my colleague Eugene Chausovsky to talk about the ever-evolving dynamics of Russia's borderland. So, Eugene, this is a region that you've traveled through very frequently, from the Baltics down to through the Carpathian states and the Caucasus, and it's a very interesting region because obviously it sits smack dab between the West and Russia. So we've talked about since the beginning of the year this idea, or perception at least, that there would be this budding romance between Putin and Trump and what that could mean for this borderland. And of course, the fragmentation of Europe only, accelerates that dynamic in many ways. But we've seen everything from the leaks to the Flynn resignation to the calls for an independent investigation in Washington on alleged links between the Trump administration and Russia, all these sorts of developments that are pointing towards some serious constraints to that U.S.-Russia détente. So let's talk through how the borderland is actually adapting in this dynamic. And why don't we just start with the most exposed countries, Poland, the Baltic states, and how they're reading the situation.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So Poland and the Baltics, as you mentioned, they're right smack dab, exposed to Russia. And these countries are very concerned, particularly about, Trump's statements as a candidate, about, the status of NATO and how the U.S. is going to treat that alliance system. But they do have some protection. I mean, just before Trump's inauguration, there was a increased presence, a semi-rotational force of NATO forces in Poland and each of the Baltic states. But they're just concerned about what's going to be the future of NATO, the future of the U.S. position to NATO. And so these countries are looking for basically, a guarantee or a commitment on the part of the U.S. But absent that, or in the case that evolves in a way that's not positive for them, they're looking to basically integrate more with each other, with the Nordic countries, and even with a country like Ukraine.
Right. So as long as that uncertainty prevails on the U.S.'s commitment to NATO, we'd really expect a country like Poland, Lithuania as well, to really be taking the lead there. But what about kind of further south, the countries that have a little bit more cover with the Carpathians, and what options that allows them?
Yeah, we've seen definitely a different position from some of these countries. Hungary, in particular, is a country that we've seen really friendly with Russia. In a recent meeting between Orban and Putin, he basically questioned, Orban did, the viability of the sanctions regime.
Right.
So very much the polar opposite of what countries like Poland and the Baltics say. And I think he's just afforded that geographic buffer space. He doesn't have any territorial disputes with Russia. So these countries are kind of more on the neutral or even Russian-leaning side of things.
On the other hand, though, Romania tends to take a more assertive stance and is always kind of concerned about what's happening in Moldova next door and Transnistria. And we've heard a lot of talk about a Black Sea proposal for NATO to step up NATO's participation there, which, of course, has Russia very nervous.
Right, exactly. I mean, Romania is more exposed to Russia because of its Black Sea location. And so we see it kind of joins the camp of Poland and the Baltics, even though it's geographically removed from them. It's got a lot of the same concerns as they do. Whereas just to the south, Bulgaria, it's a little bit more, again, neutral and wants to back off of a confrontational attitude with Russia.
Except Turkey is still key to that Black Sea proposal. And we know Turkey's being very cautious with Russia with its priorities in Syria.
Right.
Georgia has actually been very interesting lately, and we've seen some subtle moves there that are pointing toward, more of a balancing act, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, Georgia is certainly still very much intent on its Western integration process. I mean, EU and particularly NATO membership is the strategic goal of Georgia, but they have to be realistic and know that that's not coming anytime soon. So what we've seen essentially is Georgia become more pragmatic in terms of its relationship with Russia in the economic sphere. So whether it's trade ties or energy ties, they know that they have to have somewhat of a working relationship with Russia. They still want the Western integration, but as long as that Western backing isn't there to their liking, they have to work with Moscow in a certain sense.
And then, of course, with Ukraine still very much unresolved and the Minsk implementation still in limbo, between this U.S.-Russia negotiation, what can we realistically expect in terms of an evolution in Ukraine?
Right. Well, I think Ukraine probably has the most reason to be concerned with the developments that have happened. I mean, the U.S.-Russia talks, even with those limitations, just the perception of that makes Kiev very nervous, combined with the increasing divisions within Europe. I mean, these are the countries that Ukraine is trying to orient to, and it's very unclear what's happening. So that's why I think it's no coincidence that we've seen this flare up in violence in eastern Ukraine right after Trump's inauguration. I mean, basically the day after Trump had his first phone call with Putin, we've seen this spike in violence that's basically been maintained over the last month or so. And I think that Ukraine is really interested to make sure that it sees that, it being Washington, sees that this is a conflict that's not frozen, right, that needs to be negotiated. The problem is that Russia has the upper hand at this time because it's involved itself in Syria. Now you have, statements like maybe we can trade sanctions in exchange for Russian cooperation on nuclear arms reduction. So Ukraine is very nervous about how things are unfolding.
And Syria is a peripheral theater for the Russians, whereas there's very little that Russia feels like it needs to give on a vital issue like Ukraine. So another big sticking point. Now, the ever-thorny region of the Caucasus with the simmering conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, and Russia, of course, having a very strong relationship with Armenia, but also a cozier relationship with Azerbaijan. How do we see that playing out?
Yeah, this is another one of those complex, interwoven conflicts that bring in a lot of parties. But essentially what we've seen is, yes, Armenia is a Russian ally. They have Russian troops on their territory. But Azerbaijan is a country that's very strategic for Russia. And we've seen kind of a gradual warming of ties between these two countries, which was most notable when a recent flare-up in fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh that happened last April. Russia adopted a very neutral position on it. And you could even say that Russia basically gave a wink and a nod to Azerbaijan. You can flare things up a little bit, keep it contained, but we're not going to step in on behalf of Armenia. So this is an area where Russia has the potential to kind of maneuver, gain influence in both countries, try to be the arbiter in the negotiation process in order to make sure that its influence is cemented in this region.
Yeah, and they're definitely thinking long term, especially now that it has Turkey distracted, Iran, of course, very consumed. This is a good time for Russia to deepen its influence in the Caucasus. All right, thank you, Eugene. And our readers can learn more about this issue in the weekly that Eugene has written for this week. And as we know, there are limits, real limits to this U.S.-Russia détente. And if you are a borderland state, you have to be very clever to adapt to these shifting winds. And so this is an area of the world that, of course, consumes much of our attention. And if you really want to understand the future of U.S.-Russia relations, you must watch The Borderland. Thank you for joining.